Anyway, thank you all. I'm going to do two things today. One is, Eric mentioned my book project, Before the Garage, and I'm going to talk some about that, and then I want to talk about a particular case. We're talking about the beginnings of Silicon Valley. I want to talk about the very first major high-tech firm, the Federal Telegraph Company, and there's some materials from the Federal Telegraph Company right here in the Clark collection. So first of all, Silicon Valley. These different colors are counties, but Silicon Valley traditionally, until recently when San Francisco has become part of it, has been considered San Jose up to about San Carlos, Redwood City. And one thing I'd like to argue for in my book and today is that San Francisco has always been central to Silicon Valley. So anyway, a place of invention, of course. You know that downstairs, but just an example of some companies that are based there. And my period ends in 1960, and only one of these firms was started before 1960, and that, of course, is HP there on the left. Now, why do we care about Silicon Valley? Well, clearly a lot of people care. I don't even know where some of these places are. But around the world, people want to know what the secret is of Silicon Valley, whether it's a secret sauce or what have you. So, the question that I've been exploring is, how did Silicon Valley come to be? And it's a question that all those folks, in the Silicon Glens and need to know if they're all about trying to replicate something. And so let's explore this. Well, here, if you go to this, and by the way, do you guys know what this is? Anyone recognize this? It's the HP garage. That's right. On Edison Street in Palo Alto. And this is where, in 1938, William Hewlett and David Packard set up shop. And there's a plaque out there that calls this the birthplace of Silicon Valley. So this is a garage. And, of course, garage is in the title of my book. Well, here are two more garages. The one there on the left, it's kind of a small figure, but given the fact that he's casting a big shadow might suggest to you that that is indeed Steve Jobs and the garage where he and Wozniak were. And then on the right, the caption sort of gives it away what that garage was for. So, Valley of Heart's Delight, what does that have to do with garages? Well, in this area that I showed you, essentially from San Jose up to San Mateo, about 30 miles south of San Francisco, this is the way it looked. Much of it looked during my period, during 1909 to 1960. And the name Valley of Heart's Delight, I don't think anyone really knows where it came from, but it was popularized by the Southern Pacific Railroad when they were trying to convince people to move there. Nice catchy phrase. Well, the reason I show this is that this whole concept of an idea in a garage, if that's all you need to succeed, if you buy that, then these Silicon Glens and forests and plateaus and roundabouts and all that could go in, well, geez, we can go from fields, agriculture, to chips in one easy generation or two, just like Silicon Valley. And sure enough, here is a chart that sort of reflects that idea. This is courtesy of Steve Blank, who is based in Silicon Valley, a serial entrepreneur and so on. And I love this. He's talking about the waves of innovation, and the first three waves there are orchards. And then suddenly you jump to integrated circuits and personal computers and so on. So there it is, the Valley of Heart's Delight to Silicon Valley in just a couple of easy moves. Well, I would like to show you that before the Valley of Heart's Delight, or during the Valley of Heart's Delight, there were other things going on that help explain this. And one of them, if Silicon Valley had one and only one thing going for it, and it had more, but being born in the United States in the 20th century was the most important thing for this. Fact that the United States, by turn of the 20th century, was the world's foremost economy. By early in the 20th century, the world's foremost system of research universities. And as the 20th century progressed, the technological needs of a budding superpower. Three things that certainly can make a difference to a high-tech region. So let's move to San Francisco, which I mentioned is actually an important player in this story, even though it doesn't get discussed much by folks in the Valley, except in recent years when we've had some techies move up there. And of course, you recognize this as a Palace of Fine Arts, which became the Exploratorium, and which is in line with Places of Invention and so on. Well, okay, San Francisco. Why is that important to the story? Well, we had a colloquium here a few weeks ago on the gold rush and diaries from the gold rush. That actually relates to the Silicon Valley story. It was mining in the West, and not just gold mining, but silver mining and so on. A lot of the companies that were doing this mining and other extractive activity like oil and agriculture were based in San Francisco. And because of the capital that they were, all the money they were making, San Francisco becomes a major banking center, the leading banking center west of the Mississippi River. And so this is right at the time, 1900, 1960, when another generation is coming, another set of industries is coming along. So you might say that what happened in San Francisco is the repurposing of capital from one gold rush to another. And now let's move down the peninsula. Recognize this place. This is Stanford University, that's right. Academic anchor is Silicon Valley. And a lot of the stuff that you might have heard about Stanford and Silicon Valley focuses on the post-1945 era, the Cold War. And my period, starting in 1909, well, Stanford, by the time of the first major tech company in Silicon Valley, Federal Telegraph, starting in 1909, Stanford is already a big deal. By 1899, it has the biggest endowment of any university. 1900, it's one of 12 charter members, and there are only 12 of the Association of American Universities. So Stanford was born important in 1891, as were some of the other latecomers like Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, and so on. And Stanford also, early on, had what some people later refer to as steeples of excellence in engineering. And mining engineering, they produced Herbert Hoover, who was one of the most successful mining engineers in the early 20th century, and civil engineering, mechanical engineering, and then electrical engineering, which is really key to our story. Now, I've sort of set the stage. This is where we're going to shift into the roots of the Federal Telegraph Company, the first high-tech firm. Now, this guy actually wasn't involved with Federal Telegraph. He's earlier. His name is Francis McCarty. And I should give a little bit of background. This is from probably 1905. And by then, you know, this slide says wireless mania. Well, Marconi in the mid-1890s starts successfully sending wireless signals. And by the turn of the 20th century, the world, and especially places like on the east and west coast of the United States, are very excited about this technology. And so San Francisco becomes a bit of a hotbed, and the Bay Area in general. And as Susan Douglas points out, it seemed that at least on the coast, every city in America seemed to have their boy wonder. And McCarty fit the bill really well because he was a first-class techie, and he's a teenager, but he's also a good self-promoter. He's sort of like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak rolled into one. And so what happens to McCarty? Why haven't we heard of McCarty? Well, the reason is two things happened after this story was done on him. One was the San Francisco earthquake, 1906. So a lot of this technical activity in San Francisco is destroyed, and some of the folks who were involved in it moved elsewhere, some as far away as Stockton. McCarty moved to Oakland, across the bay. And there, not long after, just a couple months after he moved there, he was killed in an accident. His horse-drawn carriage, he took a spill and died. So he had patents and he had backers. He had a couple of bankers in Oakland who had been backing him. And so what are these guys going to do? They've got patents and they've got money, but they don't have knowledge. They can't do this themselves. So what do? Well, they called Stanford. And, well, they called Stanford University, and they're the chief, the head of electrical engineering, had been Harris Ryan, who had come from Cornell in 1904. They asked him, "Do you have a student? Do you know anyone who could do this?" And sure enough, he had a guy named Cyril Elwell who was from Australia, and he'd already graduated. He's doing graduate work now at Stanford. And Ryan thought that Elwell could take what McCarty had done and do something with it that might be a good investment for these bankers in Oakland. Elwell tried, and he finally concluded that no, there wasn't a big future with what McCarty had done, but he had another idea. He had been paying attention to a fellow in Denmark named Valdemar Poulsen, and him, Denmark's Edison. And so Elwell, who's an old man at 24, is trying to convince these bankers, well, maybe we could, take Poulsen's technology and do something with it. No, the Oakland bankers back out at this point. But Elwell he's very intrigued by the technology of Poulsen. And so he goes to Denmark and works out an agreement where he gets access to, and Poulsen has essentially taken, he's taken the wireless technology and has allowed for it to be transmitted further, more powerfully. So the result is the first major high-tech firm. This is Palo Alto. And so it's set up by an Australian licensing a Danes technology. And then it also, this is Palo Alto, but the company's a two-headed monster. What happens in Palo Alto is R&D and manufacturing. What happens in San Francisco is administration, finance, marketing, all the other functions of the firm. So again, there's the San Francisco connection. So $450,000, which seems like a lot of money back in 1909, and it was. That is what Elwell had to pay Poulsen for access to what was called the ARC technology in North America, and so $450,000 let's put it this way. Having looked at some of the agreements that Poulsen made in Europe, I think Elwell got taken the way a 24-year-old might. $450,000 was probably too much, and looking at the financial statements of Federal Telegraph Company, it was in difficulty from the moment that deal was made. And to complicate things, the business model of the company, the original business model, was to compete with Western Union, right? And so Elwell and Beach Thompson, who succeeded him as president, set up a network that was starting on the West Coast, and they did some sort of beta tests up and down the West Coast, and their transmission seemed to work fine. And then they moved gradually east, Phoenix, El Paso, Fort Worth, and on their way to Chicago, Kansas City. And in the summer of 1912, here we are 3 years into the company now, disaster. Now, what would be what could happen in the Midwest that wouldn't likely happen on the West Coast that would make technology, wireless technology, go awry? What would it be? Well, thunderstorms, and sort of electrical things that would cause dropped calls, essentially, the equivalent of that. And so, West Coast, things had tested fine. The minute they headed east, bad. So, failed business model. They're dead in the water heading into 1913. So what happens? Who's going to come to their rescue? Yes, right here in D.C. is the rescuer, the Federal Telegraph Company. This is Dewey's ship, the Olympia, in Manila in 1898. Two things about that. First, it was built in San Francisco. But second, this is actually the beginning of the success story. That after 1898, the United States first has overseas possessions, whether it's the Philippines or Hawaii or Guam or and so on. And so what's going to be a big need when you have all these possessions? Communications. You've got these naval bases everywhere that need to communicate with one another and then communicate with their ships. So these are the needs of a burgeoning, of a nascent overseas empire, and that comes to the rescue for Federal Telegraph, big time. And sure enough, 2,000,006. There are documents here in the Clark collection that actually show a list of all of the contracts that Federal Telegraph had with the U.S. Navy starting in 1913 and going up to 1919. And it adds up to almost 2.6. And that's just working with the Navy, but that was, of course, their primary customer. So that's a good deal for them. And so things are looking better than when they had this flawed business model. And meanwhile, I want to show you some of the folks involved in this company. The fellow at the far left is Leonard Fuller, the chief engineer, who succeeded Cyril Elwell. Elwell didn't stay with the company too long. He leaves in 1913, and Fuller succeeds him. And the other fellow of interest here to this story is second from the right. His name is Ralph Beal. And during this period, 1913 to 1919, where do you suppose he was stationed? If their major customer is the U.S. Navy. Right here. He had an office in D.C. more than 100 years ago. So that whole concept of a Washington office was way back. So here's another number, 1,000,006, and a loss of innocence. Now this is where, I think no high-tech story is complete without scandal, and we've got it in spades here. 1,000,006, during World War I, the government buys the patents, the main patents and some of the stations of the Federal Telegraph Company for 1,000,006. Well, the only problem is that only about 1 million of this 1,000,006 that the government paid to the company actually made it to the company's coffers. It turns out that the president, a guy named Washington Dodge, he and his brother-in-law set up this company called the Valencia Development Company and sort of funneled that $500,000 or $600,000 to that company, and as sort of a finder's fee. And didn't reveal this to other folks in the company. This happens in about May of 1918, and it's discovered in January 1919 by Hiram Johnson Jr., the son of Senator and one-time Governor Hiram Johnson of California. January 1919, Johnson blows the whistle on these guys, and by June, Washington judge, this upstanding member of the San Francisco community, has committed suicide. And later, some of the stories got embellished later on that the authorities were about to burst into his office when he pulled the gun out and shot himself. No, he was alone in an elevator shaft. But anyway, this did not do wonders for Federal's relationship with the federal government, Federal Telegraph's relationship. By May, in other words, a month before Dodge is committing suicide, and by then he's already been kicked out of the company, the Navy is asking Western Electric to reverse engineer Federal Telegraph's products so that they can have an alternative source because they don't trust these guys. Anyway, so the company is in bad shape. So they've been saved. Well, let me back up. They get saved another time. So here they are dead in the water, but the State Department comes to their assistance when this opportunity to build a very powerful station in China, which would be a nice thing for the United States, given that it would be nice to broadcast over the Pacific rather than communicate wirelessly across the Pacific, rather than try to use the underground or undersea cable system, which might involve British cables or Japanese cables, which tended to be eavesdropped upon. And so Federal Telegraph ends up with a $13 million contract for this station. There's only one problem with that, and that is that the Chinese had already made arrangements with 2 other countries to do the same thing. The Chinese government was in flux at this point. So the State Department, U.S. State Department, pulls a full court press on behalf of Federal Telegraph against the British and against the Japanese, who also have their eyes on building this powerful transmitter. And what ultimately happens is civil war in China, and nothing comes of it. And furthermore, the saga of Federal Telegraph, this first major high-tech firm in Silicon Valley, comes to an end. I mean, the company doesn't come to an end, but it's acquired by ITT and moved lock, stock, and barrel to Newark, New Jersey. And so that is the end of Silicon Valley's first high-tech company, but it leaves a legacy. Working at the company before it went off to New Jersey were founders of Magnavox, which actually was the first spin-off. I think the company was only a year old when these 2 guys created what became Magnavox, and which actually also began as a government contractor. Texas Instruments co-founder was an alumni of Federal, founder of Litton Industry, vice presidents of research at RCA and at ITT. Stanford, dean of engineering and provost, and UC Berkeley, chair of electrical engineering. So, Federal Telegraph wasn't alone in terms of this relationship with Washington. There's an expression that has been in academic circles now for 50 years now called the liability of newness. In fact, there was a session devoted to just that at the Academy of Management conference in August. And what it is essentially 50% of all startup companies fail during the first 5 years. 50%. And if startups can survive those first 5 years, then the chances of failure diminish rapidly. And so what's really important and has been important for a long, long time is what can get a company through those first 5 years successfully. And in the case of Federal Telegraph, starting in 1909, well, they're saved in 1913 by government contracts. And Hewlett-Packard, that garage that you guys saw earlier, well, that garage goes up in 1938. They have their first government contract in 1940. And yeah, they did provide the oscillator for the movie Fantasia, but Disney was the exception that proved the rule. That more than 80% of their business during their first 5 years was defense related. Varian Associates, same deal. They started in 1948. Ed Ginston, who was head of Varian in the 60s, but was there from 40, was there from the beginning, was quoted once as saying that he knew they had a company when they successfully got their security clearance. And then Fairchild Semiconductor, there's an industry that was essentially in America created by the government, because the transistor is invented at AT&T in 1947, but by 1949 AT&T is being sued for antitrust, and as a way to avoid having their manufacturing, Western Electric, spun off, they decided to play ball with the government and say, oh, well, given the importance of the transistor and to the Cold War, we're going to show everyone, meaning 24 American companies, how to do this and how to manufacture this. And so when William Shockley comes to Silicon Valley in 1956, he has one of those $25,000 licenses to do the semiconductor. And of course, he's one of the team that invented the transistor. And Fairchild Semiconductor was the successful spin-off from Shockley Semiconductor. And my period ends in 1960, and by 1960, these are the three biggest companies in Silicon Valley, and Fairchild has about 90% of their business with the federal government. So that's why I think that during the period 1909 to 1960, you could make a good argument that this, not the Pentagon per se, but Washington, D.C., was the capital of Silicon Valley. And so with that, I'd welcome your questions.